So now that you've learned how to find the greatest common factor, we can actually start factoring it out of these polynomials. Remember that factoring is just the opposite of multiplying. You're going to be dividing out the greatest common factor of these polynomials. So let's start with this example and find the greatest common factor of 2q to the third minus 8q. So let's start with the coefficient, I want to find the greatest number that goes into 2 and negative 8. So I know that the greatest common factor, I'm just going to abbreviate with GCF, would have to be 2, and then they each have a q. Remember, if I were to expand it out like this, 2q to the third would be 2q times q times q, and then negative 8q would just be 1q. So they both have at least one q in common. That's why the greatest common factor would have to be 2q, because 2q is the greatest factor amongst both of these terms. Alright, so now let's start factoring it out. If 2q is my greatest common factor, I can divide it out of each term. So let's start with this first term, 2q to the third power. So I'm going to divide it by 2q. Well, I know that 2 divided by 2 is just 1. And q to the third divided by q would be q squared. Okay, think of it this way. If I have 3 q's and I'm factoring one of them out, that would just leave me with 2 q's. Alright, moving on to the next term. I want to divide negative 8q by 2q. Well, negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4, and q divided by q would just be 1. They would basically just cancel, okay? Think of it like this if I were actually dividing it. Negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4, and then q divided by q cancels, so you're just left with negative 4. Okay, I had one q and I took it out, so there aren't any more q's there. So if I just simplify this up a little bit to make it a little bit more nice and neat, my answer would be 2q is what I factored out, and what I would have left in the parentheses would just be q squared minus 4. Something that's really neat about factoring is you can always check yourself by multiplying or distributing your answer back out. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, before you hit submit, check your work. Take the extra time to make sure you did it correctly. So if this was my answer, 2q times q squared minus 4, just distribute it back out, multiply it, and see if you got what you started with. So 2q times q squared would be 2q to the third, and then 2q times negative 4 would be negative 8q. So we indeed got what we started with. Yay! That means we did it correctly. Alright, let's move on to another example. Alright, we need to find the greatest common factor of 10x cubed plus 8x. So let's start with the 10 and the 8. I know that the greatest common factor of 10 and 8 is 2, because 2 divides evenly into 8 and 10, and it's the greatest number that they both have in common. Okay, now let's look at the variables. If I were to write this out, x cubed would be x times x times x, and then just 8x. So they both have at least one x in common, so the greatest common factor would be 2x. Alright, so now let's factor it out. I'm going to divide each of these terms by 2x. So 10x cubed divided by 2x would be, well, 10 divided by 2 is 5, and x cubed divided by x is x squared. Now let's go into the next one. 8x divided by 2x would just be positive 4, and I need to make sure I write that plus sign there to separate these two terms. So 8x divided by 2x would just be 4, because if I had 1x and I took 1x out, I wouldn't be left with any. Okay, so my final answer would be 2x times 5x squared plus 4. But wait, you can always check yourself. Distribute this back out and make sure you get what you started with. So if I were to multiply this back out, I know that 2x times 5x squared is 10x cubed, and 2x times 4 is 8x. So that is what we started with, so we know, yay, we did it correctly. Woohoo! Alright, another problem. So we need to find the greatest common factor again of 12p cubed minus 2p squared. So the greatest number that 12 and 2 have in common is 2. And they both have at least 2 p's. So my greatest common factor would be 2p squared. Now, I need to divide each term by 2p squared. So let's start with the first one. 12p cubed divided by 2p squared. 12 divided by 2 is 6. And p cubed divided by p squared would just be p. Okay, think about it this way. If I were to write it out in expanded notation, 12 divided by 2 is 6, and then p divided by p would just be 1, p divided by p would just equal 1, so I would just be left with 6p. Okay, you had 3 p's and you pulled out 2, so you're just left with 1. Now go on to the negative 2p squared. Negative 2 divided by positive 2 is negative 1. And then p squared divided by p squared is just 1 as well. If we need to write it out, negative 2p squared would be negative 2p times p, and then divided by 2p squared. Negative 2 divided by positive 2 is negative 1, and then p divided by p divided by p. So all your p's are canceled, so we'd just be left with negative 1. Okay, let me go ahead and box that answer in, and then let's check it to make sure we did it correctly. I could go ahead and multiply this back out. 2p squared times 6p minus 1, just to check that we did it correctly. 2p squared times 6p would give me 12p cubed, and then 2p squared times negative 1 would just be negative 2p squared. So you can see that we got exactly what we started with, so we know we did it correctly. Okay, here's another example. So we need to find the greatest common factor of 4s squared minus 16. Well, I know that 4 would be the greatest number that would go into 4 and 16. And even though 4 has an s as the variable, 16 doesn't have an s at all. So my greatest common factor would just have to be 4. So let's go ahead and divide both of these terms by 4. Okay, if I start with the first term, 4s squared divided by 4. Well, 4 divided by 4 is just 1. And then s squared divided by no variable at all would still just be s squared. Okay, It's like 4s squared divided by 4 would just be s squared, because 4 divided by 4 is just 1, so you're just left with s squared. Okay, moving on to the second term. Negative 16 divided by 4 is just negative 4. So my answer would be 4 parentheses s squared minus 4. Okay, let's go ahead and check it just to make sure we did it correctly. If I distribute the 4 back out, 4 times s squared is 4s squared, and then 4 times negative 4 is 16. So we got exactly what we started with, so we know we did it correctly. Alright, moving on up to a little bit harder problem. We want to find the greatest common factor again. So let's look at 40, 22, negative 4, and negative 18. So let's think about what number are all of these divisible by. Well, 4 does not go into 22 or 18, but I know that 2 goes into all of these numbers. So 2 would have to be the greatest common factor. And then now let's look at the variables. So I have s to the 10th, s to the 9th, s to the 4th, and s cubed. So if I were to expand all of these out, they would all have at least 3 s's. So the greatest common factor would have to be 2s cubed. So I'm going to divide each one of these terms by 2s cubed. So let's start with the first one. 40s to the 10th divided by 2s to the 3rd. Well, if I need to write it out like this, we can. 40 divided by 2 is 20. And then s to the 10th divided by s to the 3rd would be s to the 7th. Okay, remember you can just subtract those exponents, or if you need to expand them out and actually show them canceling off, you can. Okay, let's go to the next one. 22 s to the 9th divided by 2 s to the 3rd. Well, 22 divided by 2 is 11, and s to the 9th divided by s to the 3rd would be s to the 6th. Okay, you have 9 and you're pulling 3 out, so you'd be left with 6. Next term, negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. And then s to the 4th divided by s cubed would just be s. You had 4, you took out 1, so you're just left with, you had 4, you took out 3, so you're just left with 1s. Okay, then the very last term, negative 18 divided by 2 would be negative 9. And then s cubed divided by s cubed, remember anything divided by itself is just 1. So you don't have any more s's in that one. You had 3 and you took them all out, so you don't have any s's left. So my final answer would be all of this, 2s cubed times 20s to the 7th plus 11s to the 6th minus 2s minus 9. And you know, just for fun, let's go ahead and check it. If I distribute all of this back out, give me a second to write all of this. Okay, 2s cubed times 20s to the 7th would be 40s to the 10th. 2s cubed times 11s to the 6th would be 22s to the 9th. 2s cubed times negative 2s would be negative 4s to the 4th. And then last one, 2s cubed times negative 9 would be negative 18s cubed. And so you can see, if you go back up to the very beginning, we did it correctly. Alright, you survived and made it to the last problem. So let's go ahead and factor this thing and we will be done. So let's start with by finding the greatest common factor of 10 and negative 20. Well, I know that 10 goes into 10 and 10 goes into 20. So the GCF would have to be 10 for the variables, for the coefficients. Now let's look at the variables. So I'm just going to go ahead and expand this out because sometimes it's easier to see whenever you can expand it as to what they all have in common. If I have enough room here. So for the first term I have h cubed, which would be 3 h's, 6 j's, and then 5 k's. And then for the second term, I have 1h, 8 j's, goodness gracious, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then 1k. So we have to figure out of all of these, what do they have in common? What do they both have the same number of? So they both have at least 1h in common. They both have at least 6 j's in common. And they both have at least 1k. So from that I can see we have 1h, 6 j's, and 1k. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and divide each term by 10h j to the 6th k. Alright, so starting with this first one, 10 divided by 10 is just 1. Now let's look at the variables. H cubed divided by h would be h squared. J to the 6th divided by j to the 6th is just 1. And then k to the 5th divided by k would be k to the 4th. Okay, remember for these you're just subtracting them, okay? Now let's move to the next one. Negative 20 divided by 10 is negative 2. And then h squared divided by h, just be 1h. J to the 8th divided by j to the 6th would be j squared. And then k divided by k is just 1. So you don't have any k's in that last term. So that would be your final answer. Let's go ahead and check it to make sure we did it correctly. Okay, if I distribute this out, 10hj to the 6th k times h squared k to the 4th, ooh, that's a lot to say. Well, I know 10 times 1 is just 10. H times h squared would be h cubed. J to the 6th. And then k times k to the 4th would be k to the 5th. Okay, distribute out to the next term. 10 times negative 2 is negative 20. H times h is h squared. J to the 6th times j squared would be j to the 8th. And then k times just 1 would just be k. So does it match what we started with? Indeed it does. Alright, you survived your first factoring lesson. Please call me. I know this is a lot of information and it's something new to you, so if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to call and I will walk you through these. Hope you guys have a great week and I will talk to you later.